Bueno, una vez más, buenos días a todos y a todas a esta primera sesión de la 20ª edición de la serie de conversaciones Cuba en la política exterior de Estados Unidos de América, que nos reunirá desde hoy hasta el viernes 16. Mi nombre es Raúl Rodríguez, soy el director del Centro de Estudios Hemisféricos y sobre Estados Unidos de la Universidad de La Habana. Es realmente un placer poder estar aquí y compartir con tan distinguidos colegas y amigos y compañeros. Este primer panel que está a punto de comenzar va a tener presentaciones de Fulton Amstrong de la American University de Washington. Su ponencia se titula Factores que tienen influencia en la administración de la política de la Administración Biden y cuáles pudieran ser sus resultados más probables. Factors influencing Biden administration policies and their likely outcomes. Después tendremos a William Leogrande, también profesor de la American University, que nos va a hablar o nos va a comentar si existe un camino hacia de retorno hacia la normalización. Is there a road back to normalization? Seguidamente vamos a tener a Rafael González del CEHSEU, de nuestro Centro de Estudios Hemisféricos sobre Estados Unidos de la Universidad de La Habana, con la presentación Camino hacia la recomposición de relaciones entre Cuba y Estados Unidos, desafíos y oportunidades. Seguidamente, Phil Brenner, también de American University, que nos va a hablar sobre Cuba, Estados Unidos y un hemisferio occidental en cambio, o cambiado, Cuba and the United States and a changed Western Hemisphere. Y finalmente vamos a tener la colaboración, la presentación del colega Leandro Morgenfeld de la Universidad de Buenos Aires, miembro, también gusto saludar a Leandro, miembro del grupo de trabajo sobre Estados Unidos de Claxo, del cual muchos también somos miembros y hemos estado trabajando durante los últimos años. Leandro, desde Buenos Aires, de manera virtual, nos va a hablar de la política de Biden hacia América Latina y su impacto para Cuba. Sin más, cada presentador va a tener aproximadamente unos 15 minutos. Vamos a darle la palabra a nuestra primera presentación. Fulton Amstrong, por favor.
No, empezamos con Bill.
Bill, ok. Bueno. Por favor, Bill.
Sí, gracias. Yeah. So let me begin by saying what a great pleasure it is to be back here in person and have the opportunity to reconnect with colleagues and friends that many that we've known for many years. Being able to continue the dialogue over Zoom was a good thing, but this is a better thing. I want to start by just observing that the policy of Barack Obama after 2014 was really a radical break with the history of U.S.-Cuban relations after 1959. Obama repudiated the goal of regime change and was the only U.S. president to call for an end to the embargo or blockade. But then, as we know, Trump returned to the old approach that had characterized every administration before. And Biden has mostly continued with Trump's policies, with a handful of small exceptions. So the question I want to engage is, is there a road back to normalization? What does it look like? Will Biden move back towards Obama's policy? And I'll give you the answer right up front. No. I don't think Biden will move back to Biden's policy, to Obama's policy. But I do think that as the Vice Minister explained, there is space for an improvement in bilateral relations. There are things that can be done that are in the mutual interests of both countries. We've seen some hints recently that are things may be moving in a more positive direction than they did during the first 2 years of the Biden administration. But let me first engage the issue that my colleague Fulton Amstrong will engage in greater detail. But why not return to Obama's policy? What's been the problem? Biden promised during the campaign that he would return to Biden's policy for the most part, right? And it's been for the least part, actually, in practice. So 2 reasons, it seems to me. One, and these are not a surprise to any of us. One is the domestic political reason that has played a dominant role, not exclusive role, but a dominant role in US policy towards Cuba since the 1980s. And that is concern about politics in Florida. It's good to remember that President Biden's chief of staff, Ron Klain, was the chief of staff for Vice President Al Gore and played a prominent role in his election campaign in 2000 and headed up the Democrats' recount strategy in Florida in 2000. So he, and I think Democrats generally, suffer from a kind of post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of the outcome of that election. And so Florida always creates a kind of terror among Democrats. During the 2020 campaign, it was clear that Biden didn't want to talk about Cuba if he could avoid it. Then in this past set of elections, the 2022 elections, of which we'll have an entire panel later in the conference, Cuban Americans voted overwhelmingly Republican. And in a certain sense, that ought to free up the Biden administration to base its policy towards Cuba on the national foreign policy interests of the United States, rather than on what I think now is the vain hope that somehow they're going to make sufficient inroads among Cuban American voters to win elections statewide in Florida, at least for the near future. So I think Florida is no longer a swing state, but I'm not sure Democrats quite recognize it yet. There is also another domestic political issue, which is Senator Menendez, who will come back in the next Congress, still as chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, with the capacity to cause all kinds of problems for Biden's wider foreign policy agenda if Biden does anything too positive with regard to Cuba. But it's not only the domestic politics that are an obstacle, it seems to me. I think there's also ideological issues at stake. Joe Biden has a genuine commitment to international human rights. So the events of July 11 had an impact on him. It also made it harder in domestic political terms for him to take positive steps in the relationship with Cuba. And as I'm sure many of you know, Biden has framed his entire foreign policy around the global struggle of democracy versus authoritarianism. And the main adversaries that the United States has identified are the ones of the old Cold War, right? It's Russia and China. And Biden is a politician who came of age during the Cold War. This is a comfortable lens or prism through which he sees international relations. This obviously is not positive for Cuba. Cuba is, in a sense, once again caught in this global struggle. Cuba is a strategic partner of Russia, a commercial partner of China, and is seen by the United States as part of the authoritarian camp, the adversarial camp, and that makes it harder, both ideologically and politically, for the United States to take positive action. Now, there are some counter forces that push toward an improvement in relations rather than away. My colleague Phil Brenner is going to talk about the political changes in Latin America, which it seems to me are particularly important. We should recall that it was pressure from the rest of Latin America, in 2012 that played a role in pushing President Obama toward the decision to normalize diplomatic relations in 2014. And Biden's foreign policy also carries a message of a return to multilateralism, listening to our allies. If you read his speech at the Summit of the Americas earlier this year, there's a real theme of we want to be equal partners with Latin America. We want to listen to Latin America. We want to hear about how Latin Americans view issues and problems. Well, they're going to hear an earful from Latin America about US policy towards Cuba. Every major Latin American government at this point has a government of the left to some degree or other. And I think that that could be an important impetus for change in policy. And one indication of that is the appointment of former Senator Christopher Dodd, an old friend of President Biden, as special advisor to the president on Latin American issues, coming out of the role that Senator Dodd played in the summit. So what can we expect going forward? Well, I think there are good prospects for a gradual relaxation of some sanctions. We have already heard from Vice Minister that there has been an increase in the bilateral dialogues around a number of issues of mutual interest. There are 23 bilateral accords between Cuba and the United States signed in the last 2 years of the Obama administration. The Trump administration didn't repudiate those accords. It just stopped implementing them or engaging diplomatically with Cuba on the implementation of those. So the framework is still very much in place if the administration has the political will to take advantage of that framework and resume cooperative discussions. There have been, I think, some good signs, and Vice Minister mentioned a number of them. The humanitarian aid offers that the United States made, particularly after the hurricane, the progress in the dialogue on migration, the May measures, which I agree were sort of good in theory, but not so effective in practice. And yet, they begin to create a framework under which additional progress can be made. Just very recently, the Department of the Treasury licensed a small travel agency in Florida to begin providing remittance wire services, remittances to Cuba. I am hopeful that Western Union will see an opportunity here to begin to resume its provision of wire services to Cuba, which could make a significant difference, I think, in restoring the flow of remittances to what it was before Trump. There are very practical limits still on the ability of US residents to travel to Cuba, despite the restoration of the people-to-people educational travel category. One thing the United States could do, obviously, would be to change the prohibition on us staying in hotels. But I don't know if that will happen or not. That's when I'm feeling in a hopeful mood. I think maybe it will, because the people-to-people travel category doesn't have the impact it could have if unless that change is made. And then I think one of the biggest issues is, in fact, the designation of Cuba as a state sponsor of international terrorism, a designation that was made by Donald Trump for purely political reasons to complicate the Biden administration's relationship with Cuba, a designation with no evidentiary foundation whatsoever, a designation that the Biden administration pledged to review early on, although it hasn't yet, a designation that was justified by Cuba not extraditing the ELN negotiators to Colombia under the previous Colombian government, a designation which the current president of Colombia has called unjustified and called for the United States to reverse. And then there's the unanticipated problem that it has caused for the United States, which is the visa waiver program, where now a European who comes to visit Cuba finds that they have to apply for a visa to come to the United States, which has, let's say, annoyed some of our European allies. So I hope that as the administration begins to prepare the next annual report that it is required to prepare on global terrorism and state sponsors of terrorism, that it will have the good sense to take Cuba off the list, which will then obviously make an enormous difference for Cuba's ability to conduct its international financial relations. But the progress that's been made has been characterized by a kind of one step forward, two steps back. Again, as the Vice Minister mentioned, there was the denial of the fiber cable application and the designation of Cuba as a country of concern over religious freedom. When I saw that, I was sort of surprised at it. And I went back and read the report on which this designation was based. And I will tell you that the foundation of it was that a number of people of religious connection had been arrested for their actions on July 11th, which is to say they were arrested because of their behavior demonstrating, not because of their religious belief. So in my personal opinion, this designation was entirely disingenuous. So I want to end by talking about things that might be done by both sides to move relations forward. I want to borrow an idea from arms control negotiations of what's called parallel positive steps or unilateral reciprocal measures. This is something that our colleague Fulton Amstrong worked on very successfully during the Clinton administration. So let me give, and this is by no means an exhaustive list. This is just a list of things I think are plausible and would be helpful. So 3 things the United States could do. Take Cuba off the state sponsors of terrorism, which I've already discussed. Eliminate the prohibited accommodations list, which prohibits residents of the United States from staying in any hotel in Cuba in which the Cuban government has any degree of ownership, a real obstacle to significant growth in travel from the United States. And third, a resuspension of Title III of the Helms-Burton law in order to put an end to these punitive lawsuits being filed in US courts against potential investors, foreign investors in Cuba. So 3 things Cuba could do. And let me preface this by saying that Cuba doesn't have economic sanctions against the United States. And so it's a little harder to find things Cuba could do that would set a good tone in the relationship. But I think there are some. First is something Cuba has done in the past with great success, and that is to offer its good offices in support of the negotiations or discussions, I should say, underway today in Mexico between the Venezuelan government and opposition. These are discussions that the United States government supports, and the Cuban government has indicated in the past its willingness to help find a political settlement in Venezuela, of course, with the approval of the government of Venezuela, by no means over the head of the government of Venezuela. Second is a very particular issue, and that is for Cuba to allow the return to the United States of Alina Lopez Miares, a Cuban American who was convicted of espionage in an intrigue not of her own making, I would say, caught up in it. She served a sentence. She was released, but is still not permitted to leave Cuba. This would be, I think, a good humanitarian gesture that would create a good atmosphere. Third is perhaps most controversial, and that would be for Cuba to grant clemency to people convicted of nonviolent offenses on July 11 and 12, and in some of the subsequent demonstrations around the electrical outages. I select this issue because I know it's an important one to President Biden. And it's a significant obstacle to an improvement in relations. There are precedents for a gesture of this sort. President Raúl Castro worked with the Cuban Catholic Church and the government of Spain to arrange a release of political prisoners, so-called political prisoners, in 2010 as a way to help improve Cuba's bilateral relationship with the European Union as the European Union was moving away from the common position. And of course, in 2014, Cuba was willing on humanitarian grounds to release a number of prisoners designated by the United States as a humanitarian gesture, part of the process of normalization. We should have no false hopes that this is going to lead Joe Biden back to Obama's policy. But in the past, these kinds of confidence-building measures have improved relations between the two countries in ways that serve the interests of both governments, and more importantly, the interests of both the US and Cuban people. Thank you.
Agradecemos al profesor Leogrande por su presentación clara y concreta, ajustada al tiempo. Vamos a hacer un pequeñito anuncio. Se ha incorporado, como estaba en el programa, el profesor Rolando Julio Rensoli Medina, vicepresidente de la Comisión Aponte para las relaciones gobierno-intelectuales, y que nos habla sobre las relaciones gobierno-intelectuales y el tratamiento del racismo en Cuba y el impacto de eso en la relación con Estados Unidos. Bienvenido. Él será entonces la última presentación que escucharemos. Ahora le damos la palabra a Fulton Amstrong.
Thank you very much. And thank you to Ambassador Cabañas and his team at CP for the invitation. Like Bill, I'm happy to be back here and do this face-to-face, presencial. I'm going to try to offer a couple of ideas that will help understand the tremendously ironic situation we have here, in which a man who is not a conservative Democrat for all of his years in the United States Senate, who was the vice president during normalization, has now been railroaded into basically continuing Trump policies. And I can say that with a little bit of authority because I worked for Joe Biden in the United States Senate for a little while before he decided to seek employment at the White House. I worked for him there, but when he was at the White House also, I was a channel of information to him. I worked with Tony Blinken, both at the White House and in the United States Senate. And I worked for 2 years for Chris Dodd in the United States Senate, and we're all sort of hoping that Chris Dodd is the one that's going to basically be the adult in the room in Washington that gets us back to our basic American values, and with an understanding and respect, not just for Cuba, but for all of Latin America. And I'd like to say what element is missing in this. How could this be happening? And I would say it's a natural political human's behavior to want to have support for something and want to be pushed. We have great anecdotes from former presidents, FDR, LBJ, et cetera, who said, I won office, I'm in office now. Now you have to push me. You have to make me do what I know you want to do, you know I want to do, but you have to work on my team. You have to push me. And so I think it's a legitimate analytical question of how come no one's pushing them? How come there's no noise going on around them? Because I believe it's fair to say that the progressives in the United States, particularly the professional progressives in Washington, D.C., have really let the issue down. They folded, they've gone home. We did things in the past, during past administrations, when I was in the Clinton administration, as Bill had referred, we did things that were at that time much, much more difficult than what Biden is even looking at doing right now. We did it because we were smart. We think we were smart, but also because what we did is where there were not voices pushing us to do things, we created those voices. We called on those voices to come. And you know, there's a long tradition on the Cuba issue for presidents to turn to the Cuban American community to get voices, to get the mandate to do things. Sometimes on the one side of the issue, like when Ronald Reagan's team helped with the creation of the Cuban American National Foundation, patterned after AIPAC, the Jewish organization. And there had been times when, for example, during Clinton, we reached out to the community and we said, we want to do this. We know it's in your interest. And more importantly, we know that it's going to be in the national interest. So we were raising the debate up a level. It's not just political, it's a national interest sort of argument. So we have a tradition of that. George Bush, Daddy Bush, created a constituency for TV Marti, and he would go to Miami and say, "Tell me what more you want. Tell me what." And we saw in the case of Barack Obama that he created voices that turned out to be very helpful to him. That his measures wound up gaining a lot of support among Cuban Americans because it appealed to their patriotism as Americans, and it appealed to their desire to have a relationship of more constructive, not perfect, with the island as well. So it's a long tradition. That's why I think it's fair to say, where are the progressive voices? Where's the noise? Where's the pressure? It does go back to the campaign, because Biden, as Bill had said, Biden didn't take the Cuba issue on frontally. He sort of did it sideways, and he said, we'll go back to some measures, but he wasn't really totally bold. Soon after the election, between the election and his inauguration, the staff that he put on around him were campaign staff with not that much experience in what we say on the line. They were thinkers and they were assistants. They didn't have that much time on the line. They started saying, whoa, 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 times have changed. Times have changed and we don't want to go there. And we said, okay, in what way have they changed? And they never really articulated it except for the Miami elections, the election results in Miami, which was actually grossly mishandled by the Democratic Party. It was not a vote against Cuba policy or a vote against Venezuela policy. It was a vote against the Democrats that they tried to make look like buddies of Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, calling them socialists and that he was allied with socialists. And they mishandled that. And so they wanted political cover, and they did it then by changing the policy. So I think that first reflection is working for Joe Biden. I found that when Joe Biden was there, Joe Biden wanted staff to give him the best proposals based on the national interest, not the political interest. You bring the political interest later in your strategy of how to achieve things. And that's why Joe Biden was very, very important in managing problems with China for many years. He was important also during the Clinton administration and successors in managing aspects of the North Korea policy, including putting surveillance techniques in place that the North Koreans had accepted, which later were withdrawn. So he was a man who said, I want to find solutions, not just score cheap political points. So he was cautious, but when he was staffed well, both analytically and politically with the strategies, he stepped up and he did quite well. That was the case also when he was vice president and the policy of normalization was put in place. We all know that his statements during the campaign were somewhat ambiguous, etc. But in this case, the unique thing is the staff from the very beginning were not giving the signal, make me do it. They were giving the signal, don't make me do it. And it became pretty clear that they didn't want to touch the issue. And so they wanted at the staff level They wanted to say, we're going to out-Trump Trump on Cuba policy because they had this fictional belief that they would be able to capture the Cuban American vote in Florida. It was false. And now with the election results, they hopefully are going back to the drawing table and saying that failed, maybe we can do it. And I personally believe, knowing Chris Dodd as I do, and some of the little signals that we're seeing about them saying things to Latin Americans about making a little bit of noise, and they're doing this, that maybe now we will have this space. We've wasted 2 years. There were 2 years in which the embargo was strengthened, as the Vice Minister had said, in articulate detail and accurate detail, strengthened during COVID. During COVID, one of the most cruel things was at least find some exceptions to let things go forward during COVID. And so it didn't happen. And now, after 2 years, hopefully they'll feel that there's some political space. But it's important to know that the progressives have not objected in Washington. They haven't objected to a lot of these measures, a lot of the Trump-Biden measures staying in place. And they've pushed less and less hard for the big picture normalization process and satisfied themselves with little incremental crumbs on issues that do matter a lot. The migration is a very important matter, but I think you have to remember that for Americans, migration isn't just Cuba. It's a huge political liability for this administration from all of Central America, Mexico, et cetera. And so it's good that the US is coming back into these processes to exchange views with Cuba on the migration issue. But let's remember, it is really quite a selfish political move on their part. They have a problem they have to manage, and they will do it. But the progressives haven't been on the front line pushing. When the administration refused, even this administration, even though the intelligence community has unanimously said that the so-called sonic attacks were not a Cuban operation and that there was no evidence that Cuba was witting to, if there were attacks, entre comillas, that Cuba was part of it. This administration has yet to pull back, has yet to apologize to people who it made false accusations against, has yet to rehire people who are on task forces who gave them, quote, the wrong answer and all. And so we need to come clear on these sorts of things, but the progressives were silent. The progressives, when administration officials claimed that they were holding a policy review in 2021, it was obvious that they were not, but progressives didn't call their bluff. And so progressives said, well, let's not criticize yet. They're doing a policy review. But there was no policy review, as we know, except to perhaps tighten some of the measures. When the administration rolled out its bare minimum adjustments out of, 247 Trump measures, they chose a handful of some, which are significant. Remittances are very important. But when they chose those, and without a rollout plan, we're still waiting for the rollout plan on some of these things, the praise for those measures was so intense. I worked in the White House. I worked in the State Department. When you get that sort of praise, you know, we can sit back now. We don't need to do more. And I faulted the progressives for folding too early in the game on that. Reactions were muted when the administration continued the prohibitions on US travel. Yes, groups can come, but it's for the purpose of supporting civil society, promoting people's independence from Cuban governments. In other words, consistent with the regime change policy. The regime change policy, not a Biden-Obama policy, but so we're moving backward. I think you said 1 step forward, 2 steps backward. These are big steps quite backward. The progressives were silent when officials pledged recently and renewed the pledge to increase harassment of European visa waiver, ESTA travelers. So now they have to go in line and pay $200 for their visa, et cetera. When the White House officials since February, I think it was March or April, a White House official asserted that US sanctions against Russia were, quote, by design, intended to have an impact on Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, which is coincidentally John Bolton's troika of tyranny. Who's running policy? Who's making policy? Who's even doing the sanity check on policy? And right?
Like sanity check. Right?
A sanity check. And time and again, in other words, that people who consider themselves progressives on the issue have failed to defend their positions. So how can we make progressives progressive again? I think that there are several causes, and these things didn't start overnight, and they will take time to move forward. Thank you. One is to read the results of the Miami elections, of the Florida Hialeah elections and stuff. One is to read them and meditate and say, have we sacrificed important policies for a non-existent political gain? A couple of things. One, some of them are saying, and if I'm wrong, you can correct me, that their funding after normalization started, the funders said, good, battle won, let's go home. And that they haven't had the same level of funding. And what they've decided to do is go back to an easier mission of monitoring human rights. There are serious people in Washington who used to do serious policy review work who are now doing human rights appraisals and stuff. And I think that that's one of the problems. If it is funding, then they have to do it. Maybe if Cuba could have a Section 109 of its Helms-Burton law and give them $25 million, I'm just being a joke, just making and stuff. So that they have changed their missions largely to not look at policy and look at how the US is worsening or improving conditions for people in Cuba, Venezuela, particularly those two. And so they have basically said, we're going to judge those governments, not our own government. And again, when you're doing policy, you're sitting at the White House or the State Department, and someone says, good job, good job. By the way, I'm not going to look at your side of this game, then you feel a little bit freer. So I would argue that they need to get back to the basic. The other thing is they did correctly identify that a problem with the Obama policy was that they didn't do enough work on the Hill. To lift the embargo, of course, was too big of a mission, but they didn't do anything on the Hill legislatively. They didn't do these little points just to burst a couple of little more holes legislatively. But when they go up to the Hill, they go to the special interests, not the Cuba policy. And you find out then that an agriculture state person doesn't understand the Cuba issue well enough to support you on the broader measures that are necessary for normalization. And you wind up then sacrificing a lot to get one Republican here, one Republican there, but you've sacrificed the broader policy thing. Another really important one, and I think this is one that will lead to a humble recommendation that I would make, is that the Helms-Burton Section 109 democracy promotion regime change programs have really contaminated the information pool in many, many corners, including in think tanks and in former advocacy organizations. We have spent hundreds of millions of dollars, as you know, since the program started in 1996 to train people who are independent of the Cuban government, but not necessarily independent of us, and to feed us what we need to support our policy. And these covert action programs run by USAID, the National Endowment for Democracy, and the State Department have created these political influence operations that are now influencing our pool of information quite strongly. And that's a problem. What should the progressives do? They should demand greater transparency of these programs, greater consultation, greater accountability of the programs, and of course, question information regardless of source. If the Cuban government puts out a fact or an assertion, it's looked at with filters. If the opposition puts out a fact or an assertion, it should be looked at with the same filters. And we have to do that. There's an internal US government problem that anybody who's worked in Washington, like Ambassador Cabañas knows, and that is that our bureaucrats at the State Department principally, but other agencies as well, are not institutionally protected from political pressures. They're under constant political pressure. They will respond to those who can inflict punishment on them. And on the Cuba issue, we know who does the punishing. We know that. They should be given protection. Progressives often excuse, especially because they have some friends who are in the institution carrying out the same Trump policies as before, excuse the bureaucrats' careerism as a necessary survival tactic, which I think is sort of funny because I had been in positions where senior government officials tried to get me fired because I wasn't giving them the information that they wanted. And I know that you can survive. I know that that's not a good excuse. And to say that Bob Menendez is going to hold the Biden administration's policies hostage over the Cuba issue shows that Washington power doesn't work that way. A chairman doesn't do that. A chairman is usually desperate to be on the team and will sacrifice some key things. So we need to be aware that there's really no excuse for the bureaucrats to be working for 2 or 3 senators when we all know that there are other senators with interest as well. I'll finish up. I think I'm over time. That's my 3 minutes more? No, I don't need 3 minutes more. I'll be faster. What can Cuba do? What can Cuba do? In remarks from this dais before, presented hopefully with appropriate decorum, humility, and diplomacy, I've offered some ideas, and so I feel that I'd like to offer some today. Cuba might be able to change the dynamics on getting the progressive voices to become progressive again. I'm not talking about the solidarity groups. They're there, but the solidarity groups usually aren't very effective, to tell you the truth. They're not really effective. They're too easy to identify, and their agenda is not very deep. But the Cuba can do things. Precedent shows that there are ways that Cuba can better inform the narrative of journalists, the bureaucrats, and even some in academia. Indeed, the technical report put out on the so-called sonic attacks by the report by the Cuban scientists, and Ambassador Cabañas' session where he brought the scientists to Washington, sat side by side with American scientists and said, this story doesn't make sense. Don't continue to carry on these sorts of stories. That changed the narrative. There's still people who want the narrative to continue. They called that law for the victims or the patients or the symptoms reporters. They called it Havana on purpose, the Havana law and stuff. But the fact is that there's no association at all now with the so-called sonic attacks and Cuba. And that was one thing where Cuba did successfully change the narrative in a significant way. I realized that when we talk about Cuba leaning forward a little bit, I've worked on a lot of Latin America, and I know that it's not uniquely Cuban. It's in fact many countries of the region that they don't want to be seen as rendir cuentas, especially to the United States or to the international community. We can understand that, but we have to be honest that in this world where information is flying around, including very bad information flying around at hypersonic speeds, if you don't put out your version of the narrative and facts to support your version of the narrative, you're going to lose. And so I think that one of my modest recommendations would be that while Cuba, an effective communications policy, might not win the information war, it could win a lot more battles if we got out there with more complete information that comes out eventually, but it comes out slow. And the battle's over and everybody's already moved on to the next battle. And to do it in social media, not just traditional media. And I've worked in bureaucracies. I know what it's like to clear talking points and clear speeches, but there are ways to do it in a way that you get the battlefield faster. In closing, I'll return to the main premise. Without more dynamic interest, more pressure, and more noise from people who consider themselves progressives, who consider themselves supporters of normalization, and who believe that normalization is in the interests of the United States and Cuba, Cuban policy in the second half of Biden is likely to advance at a snail's pace. But, and it's a very important but, the adult supervision may have arrived. The appointment of former Senator Dodd to sit above the bureaucrats who are protecting their careers, and political appointees who usually were supposed to be agents of change of policy, but the political appointees in this administration are advocates of stasis, of non-change in it. But Dodd will be sitting above all of these people who have put all of their careers or their political ambitions before the policy. And he will, if he's the same Chris Dodd that I worked for, he will basically kick ass and say, let's get to work. Let's get to work. Let's make good policy, good arguments, because I think he knows, having worked with him, I know that he knows that if you shine a bright enough light on a policy, that the real underlying factors will become clearer and easier to manage and move on. So he faces a lot of obstacles from the bureaucracy and some in the Congress, as we've both outlined, but at least some solid incremental progress is likely. But if progressives want to restore normalization, progressives have to get out and fight. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias a Fulton Amstrong por su presentación. Ahora le damos la palabra a Rafael González Morales del Centro de Estudios Hemisféricos sobre Estados Unidos de la Universidad de La Habana. Con su presentación, está por ahí. El camino hacia la recomposición de las relaciones entre Cuba y Estados Unidos, desafíos y oportunidades.
Sí, ¿se oye? Buenos días y muchas gracias por la oportunidad de estar en este evento una vez más. El tema nuestro básicamente va a ser un enfoque sobre si es posible o no la recomposición de las relaciones entre Cuba y Estados Unidos.
Good morning. It is a pleasure to be here today. My presentation will deal around the recomposition of relations between Cuba and the United States and whether it is possible or not.
Nuestra presentación va a ser guiada por 3 preguntas esenciales que ustedes dirán si somos capaces de responder o no.
We have 3 questions that will serve as a thread to our presentation, and you will tell us if we were able to provide an answer to these questions or not.
La primera pregunta es ¿qué ha motivado al gobierno de Biden a continuar la política de máxima presión?
The first question is, what are the motivations for the government, for the Biden administration to continue applying the maximum pressure policy?
La segunda, ¿cuál es la lógica que prevalece hoy en la política hacia Cuba?
The second one is, what is the prevailing logic in the politics toward Cuba?
Y la tercera, ¿cómo es posible avanzar hacia la recomposición de las relaciones?
And the third one is how it is possible to move forward towards the recomposition of relations with the United States.
Nuestra presentación va a tener 4 momentos esenciales. El primero sería en torno al modelo de análisis que estamos utilizando para hacer esta interpretación.
Our presentation is going to have 4 points. The first one is the analysis model we will use to go over the relations between Cuba and the United States.
El segundo, el proceso de revisión de la política del 11 de julio.
The second will be the review process of politics and July 11.
Tercero, la lógica de Washington que estamos viendo en este minuto en términos de las prioridades.
The third one would be the logic that Washington is using to set the priorities in 2022.
Y el cuarto, lo que serían los fundamentos de un camino hacia la recomposición.
And the fourth one will be the basis of a road to recomposition.
Sí, nuestro modelo de análisis parte de la siguiente tesis. Las relaciones entre Cuba y Estados Unidos ocurren dentro de ciertos límites y eso es lo que nos da que existe un marco estratégico.
Our model of analysis is based in the fact that there are certain limits in the relation between Cuba and the United States. So it sets a strategic framework in our relations.
Y además, el modelo de análisis incluye un elemento que tiene que ver que esas relaciones, estos ciertos límites, están permeados en gran medida por la política de Estados Unidos hacia Cuba.
And this model of analysis also encompasses that these limitations are set by the United States in the relations with Cuba.
Entendemos que esto es un punto de partida necesario para poder interpretar lo que vamos a decir explicando.
We think this is an important starting point that will help to understand what we are going to explain later on.
Sí, en estas relaciones hay una coexistencia permanente de la hostilidad y la cooperación.
In the Cuba-US relation, there is a permanent coexistence of hostility and cooperation.
Es una especie de moneda que tiene 2 caras, una cara donde está la dimensión confrontación y una cara donde está la dimensión de intereses públicos.
They are like 2 sides of a coin. In one coin, we have in one side we have the permanent hostility, and the other one, the cooperation.
No es posible lograr un punto intermedio.
It is not possible to reach a midpoint in this coexistence.
O hay una inclinación hacia la confrontación y la hostilidad, o una inclinación hacia la cooperación y los temas de interés común.
There is either a leaning towards hostility or towards cooperation.
Y eso está en dependencia en gran medida del diseño específico que se analice de la política de Estados Unidos en determinadas circunstancias.
And it largely depends on the design of the policy of the United States that it's analyzed at a certain moment.
Lo que sí está claro es que los intereses mutuos dentro de este marco de relaciones son elementos que tienen un gran potencial y son en términos cuantitativos, incluso cualitativos, tienen mayor peso que la confrontación.
But what is certain is that there's certain elements that are in quantity and qualitative factors that have a big weight in the analysis of the relations between the two countries.
Ahora, en términos prácticos, todo esto conduce, cuando analizamos la política de Estados Unidos hacia Cuba, a hablar de un grupo de factores determinantes.
In a practical sense, this leads to talking about some determining factors in the relation between Cuba and the United States.
Lo que vamos a ir analizando en la exposición. En primer lugar, la política es una expresión de este grupo de factores que están incidiendo.
And we're going to go over these factors in this presentation. The first one is that the policy is a vision of the relations between Cuba and the United States.
Hay un grupo de factores ahí, nosotros entendemos, hay tres que son esenciales.
And within these factors, there are three we consider are essential.
Y que están incidiendo de manera particular en las manifestaciones de política del gobierno de Biden.
And that have an influence in the way the Biden administration express its policy towards Cuba.
El primero tiene que ver con la visión que tenga el gobierno estadounidense sobre cómo Cuba contribuye o no en el cumplimiento de sus intereses y prioridades nacionales.
The first one have to do on how the U.S. government see how Cuba fulfills or not its national interest.
Eso nos pone en el punto de si Cuba constituye una oportunidad o si Cuba constituye una amenaza.
So it puts Cuba either as an opportunity or a threat.
Cuba no es capaz, no tiene la capacidad de definir la visión estratégica del gobierno estadounidense hacia Cuba.
Cuba has no capacity to define the vision of the U.S. government toward Cuba.
Ahora, el otro elemento clave sería la percepción del gobierno estadounidense sobre la evolución de la situación interna en Cuba.
The other key factor is how the U.S. government perceives the evolution of the internal situation in Cuba.
¿Qué está pasando en los procesos económicos, procesos políticos, ideológicos y sociales?
What is happening at the economic, political, and social level.
Que nosotros consideramos que es un factor clave.
And we think this is a key factor.
Y especialmente determinante.
And the one that has a special weight in the
Y el
way
movimiento de ese factor
she.
ubica en gran medida en altera la visión de Cuba dentro de la proyección de la política exterior estadounidense.
And this vision greatly changes the way Cuba is perceived within the U.S. government.
Y ahí está incluido, que es lo que vamos a abordar en parte de la ponencia, la variable migratoria.
And it includes the migration variable, which we are going also to speak about in this presentation.
Y otro factor importante sería la posición hacia Cuba del presidente de Estados Unidos, altos funcionarios y la burocracia gubernamental.
Another factor is the position of the U.S. president, the bureaucrats, and the politicians towards Cuba.
Nosotros consideramos que el resto de los factores que están mencionados ahí, que tienen que ver con la capacidad de influencia, vamos a decir, de la derecha cubanoamericana, todo lo que tiene que ver con determinados sectores en Estados Unidos que apoyan o promueven un cambio de política, lo que tiene que ver incluso con las tendencias políticas en la comunidad cubana del voto y la correlación de fuerza, son factores en este minuto que están subordinados a esos tres factores principales.
And we consider that all the other factors playing a role in the way the U.S. government sees Cuba, such as the right wing of the Cuban Americans, and the way the Cuban Americans influence on the policy towards Cuba, are all subordinated to these three key factors.
Vamos a ver muy rápido el proceso de revisión de esta política, que, bueno, si asumimos que el 16 de mayo es un punto de inflexión en cuando se anunciaron flexibilizaciones, estamos hablando de 16 meses, y un prolongado proceso de revisión. Ahora, ahí hay un grupo de tendencias.
First, we're going to speak about the review of the policy. If we take into account that on May 16, they announced a flexibilization of Cuba policies towards Cuba, we have a period of 16 months in which, since they announced the start of this review.
Nosotros hemos identificado a partir del 20 de enero y hasta el 11 de julio al menos 7 tendencias principales que caracterizaron este proceso de revisión de la política. En primer lugar, desaparece la urgencia de eliminar las políticas fallidas de Trump, bajo el argumento de Cuba no es una política.
And from the period between January 10th to July 11th, we identified 7 points that has led this review of the policy of the U.S. towards Cuba. First is the elimination of the urgency to eliminate the Trump failed policies under the argument that Cuba is no longer a priority.
Se establece con claridad que no se retornaría a la política de Obama.
It is clearly stated that they won't go back to Obama's policies.
Sí, la retórica del gobierno se enfoca fundamentalmente en temas de derechos humanos y democracia.
The rhetoric of the government is mainly focused on human rights and democracy.
Si se prioriza la confrontación, no existe disposición en dialogar sobre temas de interés común.
Confrontation is prioritized and there is no interest in talking or cooperating on topics of interest, of mutual interest.
Se privilegia el proceso de consulta a la derecha cubanoamericana.
They give more privilege to the consultation process with the Cuban American right wing.
Sí, en tiempos y en un escenario muy complejo de pico pandémico, no se realizan ni siquiera flexibilizaciones mínimas por razones humanitarias.
And in the time of a pandemic peak, they do not conduct flexibilizations.
Y se muestra un gobierno realmente con falta de determinación, carente de creatividad y sin un enfoque de política propia.
And the government shows itself as lacking determination and creativity and without an approach, without its own approach when it comes to the policy towards Cuba.
Esto conduce a un escenario donde la política de máxima presión de Trump se mantiene inamovible.
And this leads to a scenario in which Trump's policy remains unchangeable.
Con serias implicaciones, esto es un daño severo, integral y sistemático al pueblo cubano.
Which severely damage in an integral and systematic way the Cuban people.
La severidad por la crudeza de su impacto, la integralidad por el alcance que tiene en diferentes áreas y la sistematicidad por la recurrencia en el tiempo de manera diaria.
The severity due to the cruelty of this influence, the integral because it has a large scope, and the systematic because it's being a continuous process.
Uno puede preguntarse, ¿qué explica este comportamiento? Sí, nosotros hemos identificado que se han argumentado dos factores principales. Uno, el riesgo político electoral asociado al voto cubanoamericano y la influencia de los legisladores cubanoamericanos. Entonces nosotros nos hacemos una pregunta, si estos factores son suficientes para explicar la política de máxima presión.
When we try to explain the reasons behind this behavior, we have two reasons. One, if the political risk of the vote of the Cuban Americans, and also the influence of the Cuban American representative. And this poses a question: are these two elements the real reason to have this position?
Queríamos detenernos unos minutos en ver el valor explicativo de este argumento y sobre todo el factor electoral. Partimos de la premisa que no hay riesgo político electoral si no existe posibilidad de ganar.
We would like to explain these two behaviors, and the first one is the electoral political risk, which doesn't exist if there is no possibility to win.
Si el resultado de las elecciones de 2020, un 62% de los cubanoamericanos votando por Trump, según la encuesta, la última del dice Amandi, indicaba que ese voto era una causa perdida, con una perspectiva de 2022-2024 muy clara, que se confirmó con el resultado de las elecciones inmediatamente.
The elections in 2020 confirmed that the Cuban American vote was a lost cause for the Democrats. According to the recounting, 62% of the Cuban Americans voted for Trump. And it showed that the chances of winning that vote for the Democrats in 2002 and 2004 were very slim, which was confirmed in the elections that just took place.
No es posible que un partido sin estrategia y sin un tipo de diseño de capacidad movilizativa pueda aspirar a captar el voto.
And it is not possible for a party that doesn't have the capacity to mobilize the people to reverse that situation in the Cuban American community.
Y lo otro, que la política hacia Cuba, los tres principales temas que motivan el voto de los cubanoamericanos, no está determinado ni está definido por la posición de los candidatos con relación a la política hacia Cuba. Es decir, la línea dura no determina el voto.
And third, the policy towards Cuba does not determine the position of the chances of the candidates to win the Florida. The hard line is not a determining factor.
Aquí se muestra a partir de una fuente muy valiosa que son las encuestas de la FIBA. Aquí se encuentra el profesor Guillermo Renier y quería citar algo que él decía en unos últimos artículos. Es extremadamente improbable que gran parte del electorado cubanoamericano gravite hacia el Partido Demócrata simplemente porque mantiene una actitud beligerante hacia Cuba.
And here we have some data from the International University of Florida, in which we quote Professor Guillermo Grenier, who said that it is extremely unlikely that a large part of the Cuban American voters will gravitate towards the Democrat Party.
Next one.
Gravitate towards the Democrat Party simply because they keep a belligerent attitude towards Cuba.
Entonces, hay evidencia de la misma encuesta que los votantes cubanoamericanos sí favorecían levantar temporalmente medidas durante la pandemia. Mandando datos de 2020, se mantuvo esta tendencia en el 2021 y el 2022 confirma estos porcientos más elevados. Restablecer emisión de visados en La Habana, retomar programas de reunificación familiar, restablecer vuelos a provincia y medidas para mejorar el bienestar económico del pueblo cubano.
These data show that the Cuban voters do favor the temporary lifting of the measures during the pandemic, which is a percent that has remained higher during 2020, 2021, and 2022. Also, the resuming of visa issuance in Havana, the resuming of the family reunification program, the reestablishment of flights to provinces, and measures to improve the economic well-being of the Cuban people. So why the Biden administration ignored these demands?
Si la lógica era electoral, ¿por qué el gobierno de Biden ignoró estas demandas?
If the logic is ruled by what the voters want, why Biden chose to ignore this?
Eso nos pone en una disyuntiva de preguntarnos cuál es el valor explicativo real de este factor y nosotros entendemos que existe otro factor.
So it makes us believe that there are other reasons underlying his decision.
Ayudarnos un poco a entender la esencia de la motivación.
And these factors could help us understand his choice.
Y entendemos que sería la percepción del gobierno estadounidense que la compleja situación en Cuba constituía una oportunidad única para forzar cambios internos.
And we think that the complex situation in Cuba was perceived by the US government as a unique opportunity to force internal changes.
Hay tres elementos clave. En primer lugar, nosotros consideramos que concluyeron que la política de máxima presión de Trump era funcional a sus intereses.
And the first one we think is that they reached to the conclusion that the maximum pressure policy of Trump was work for their interest.
Y flexibilizar esta política sería darle oxígeno y una especie de darle un salvavidas al gobierno cubano.
And relaxing this policy will be a way of giving oxygen or throwing a lifesaver to the Cuban government.
Estamos hablando de 16 meses, 16 meses es un tiempo considerable para meditar. Entendemos que esto es una decisión deliberada, meditada y calculada para deteriorar la situación interna y provocar presión social en Cuba.
We're talking that they have a period of 16 months to review the policy of Trump towards Cuba, and they decided in this time that they deliberately and carefully decide that keeping this policy was good for their purposes.
Y evidentemente apreciaron que tenían condiciones favorables para socavar el respaldo al liderazgo político cubano y generar integración y conformidad, demandas en amplios sectores de la población.
And they also saw that they had conditions that were favorable for undermining the support to the Cuban political leadership and to generate irritation, disconformity, and demands in wide sectors of the population.
Bueno, sobre esta lógica, sobre esta percepción y sobre esta concepción, llegamos evidentemente a los sucesos del 11 y 12 de abril.
And with these factors in mind and this logic and the reasons behind this logic, we reach the events on July 11.
Nosotros nos preguntamos, esto está montado sobre entender para los analistas, ¿no? Lo que hablamos de estos temas, es muy importante entender cuál es la lógica desde Washington. Claro, una mirada desde La Habana, pero entendiendo un poco la lógica desde Washington. Entonces, la mirada desde Washington.
Well, us experts here in Havana try to see the reasons and the way Washington saw the events on July 11.
Sí, se refuerza evidentemente la percepción que venían evaluando oportunidad única, lo que representaba Cuba en ese momento, una oportunidad única.
So this reinforces the perception that this situation was a unique opportunity.
Interpretaron que había una fractura significativa del consenso popular.
they interpreted this situation as a major fracture of the popular consensus.
Concluyeron que era necesario entonces incrementar presiones sobre el gobierno cubano.
So they concluded it was necessary to exert more pressure on the Cuban government.
Apreciaron que el escenario les permitiría avanzar en acciones de aislamiento internacional.
And they saw that this scenario was favorable to promoting actions for international isolation.
El 22 de julio hicieron anuncios que indican todo esto.
And the announcements they made on July 29 are proof of this.
Y entonces esto de momento altera de manera significativa la prioridad que tenía el tema Cuba dentro de la agenda de política exterior de esta administración.
And this event changes the priority Cuba had in the agenda of the government.
Y se le empieza a dar un tratamiento a Cuba desde la visión de una situación de crisis.
And they start treating Cuba from the point of view of a situation of crisis.
Para que ocurre algo, estamos hablando de julio, hasta hay una variable que en ese minuto todavía no ha tenido una manifestación, que es la variable migratoria. Y nosotros entendemos que en este minuto, cuando uno lo analiza desde hoy, aquí hubo un proceso del entusiasmo en los momentos recientes del proceso de julio a la frustración después.
So at this time, the variable of migration was not as important as it is now. And we understand that this increase in the migration reflects that the initial enthusiasm following the events on July 11 has moved to frustration.
Entonces, el factor migratorio es determinante en los movimientos que se producen en la política de Estados Unidos.
The migration flow also plays a determining role in the movements within the policy of the United States
El mes de
towards Cuba.
2021 es el mes donde se decía, a partir de ya que las condiciones de la pandemia eran diferentes, el impacto de la COVID, el flujo era normal y habitual de manera gradual de flujo aéreo de nuestros aeropuertos, específicamente el aeropuerto internacional. Y empieza a crearse las condiciones ya prácticas donde los cubanos pueden, vamos a decir en términos prácticos, viajar hacia el exterior.
As we can see here, we can see the differences in the numbers and here after the announcements of May 16, we can see how the Cubans start to, now they have the possibility to freely travel to other countries, and we see an increase in the number of Cubans and the movement in the airports, mostly in the international airport José Martí.
Entonces, evidentemente, el factor migratorio también acelera dos elementos fundamentales. Uno, las conversaciones migratorias del 21 de abril, que cuando uno ve la gráfica, uno se da cuenta que en febrero, ya el dato es preocupante, pero ya en marzo estamos hablando de 32.150 cubanos arribando a la frontera sur con Estados Unidos.
The migration flow prompted the migration talks on April 21. As we can see in this graph, in this timeline, in February we have an increase in the number of Cubans traveling abroad. Well, but the high, and we see that in March this number doubled, and we have over 32,000 Cubans trying to migrate.
Se llega el 16 de mayo con un grupo de anuncios de 4 áreas fundamentales: el área migratoria, el área de viajes e intercambio. Vamos a llamarle un área que tiene que ver con los empresarios independientes y el área de remesas.
And so we have the announcements on May 16 that cover 4 main areas. One is the migration area, in which they resume the family reunification programs. The second one, if travels and exchanges with the specifically the remittances to private ownership, private entrepreneurs, also independent entrepreneurs and remittances.
Incluso la secuencia que hay ahí de 1, 2, 3, 4 es la secuencia en que están en el parchís de la Casa Blanca.
Also, the order of these announcements is the order in which they appear in the fact sheet of the White House.
Y una interpretación esencial nos conduce a que el tema de urgencia es la situación migratoria, pero vamos a decir que el tema estratégico, la visión, está asociado a los empresarios independientes.
And we can see here that in this urgency, the migration plays a leading role, but that the underlying factor is the private entrepreneurs.
Que formulación con relación a este sector está en 3 de las 4 medidas, o 3 de las 4 áreas.
And as we can see in 3 of the 4 announcements, these private entrepreneurs are a part of these announcements.
Ahora, ¿cuál es la lógica que prevalece en este minuto desde nuestro punto de vista en relación a la política de salud? Tiene que ver con las prioridades.
So what is the prevailing logic in the US policy towards Cuba?
Primero, no hay duda, en mi opinión, que la prioridad esencial en este minuto es disminuir el flujo de migrantes cubanos hacia la frontera sur.
I have no doubt that among the priorities, the first one is to decrease the flow of Cuban immigrants towards the south border.
Es la urgencia.
It's the urgency of the moment.
Pero simultáneamente hay prioridades. Segunda, privar y obstaculizar al gobierno cubano a sus principales fuentes de ingresos.
The second priority is to deprive the Cuban government of its main sources of income.
Socavar aceleradamente el consenso interno y el apoyo al liderazgo político.
To quickly undermine the internal consensus and the support to the political leadership.
Estimular el empoderamiento del sector privado de la economía.
Encourage the empowerment of the private sector of the economy.
Y mantener en alto perfil el tema de derechos humanos en la agenda bilateral.
And to keep the issue of human rights as a high-profile issue in the bilateral agenda.
Por eso, entender cuáles son las condiciones, si es posible o no avanzar en un proceso de recomposición, hay que analizar, hay que evaluar los puntos de partida.
So to understand and see whether a recomposition process is possible, we first have to see the priorities in the agenda.
Y este es el camino que estamos transitando en este minuto.
And this is the path we are working on right now.
Que tiene implicaciones. En primer lugar, preserva la política de máxima presión.
And the implications of this agenda is that it keeps the maximum pressure policy.
Prevalece la confrontación en las relaciones gobierno-gobierno y los condicionamientos.
The confrontation in the government-government relationship prevails.
Los espacios de diálogo son limitados, están enfocados fundamentalmente en temas de seguridad nacional.
The spaces for dialogue are limited and they are mainly focused on national security topics.
Y esto crea un clima político tal que no permite avances en las relaciones bilaterales.
And the political climate between the two countries does not allow to move forward in the bilateral relations.
Pero hay un grupo de inconsistencia cuando uno analiza las prioridades. Hay tres fundamentalmente.
But there are some inconsistencies when we analyze these priorities. There are mainly three.
Que en nuestra opinión, la evaluación que se haga en este minuto de estas inconsistencias podría ponernos, sin alejarnos de este camino, en algunas medidas hacia el futuro de flexibilizaciones limitadas.
In our opinion, without moving too far away from this road to working on the bilateral relationships, this inconsistency could help us to see some measures that we could take in the future.
Si la prioridad es disminuir el flujo de migrantes cubanos hacia la frontera sur, la respuesta no está solamente en medidas de política migratoria.
If the aim is to reduce the flow of immigrants towards the south border, the answer is not to put some migratory rules in place.
Eso lleva a la lógica que el gobierno estadounidense tendría que adoptar medidas de flexibilización que tengan un impacto tal que hay una mejoría de la economía cubana.
It goes to the logic that the US government should take some measures to improve and to make more flexible the economic exchange with the Cuban government.
Pero ¿qué sucede? Que eso chocaría con una prioridad que sería evitar que el gobierno cubano genere fuentes de ingresos y evitar de que el gobierno cubano sea el promotor de la prosperidad del pueblo cubano.
But improving the economic conditions for Cuba will imply that they cannot longer prevent the Cuban government from being the engine of the Cuban economy and from being the main provider of behind the well-being of the Cuban people.
Con relación al sector privado. No es posible empoderar al sector privado en Cuba si no se crean condiciones mínimas para su desempeño.
And the third one has to do with the private sector. It is not possible to promote and push the development of the private sector if we do not create conditions for the development.
Y yo siento que el gobierno estadounidense tiene eso bien claro.
And I feel that the US government is quite clear about it.
En el lenguaje de los anuncios del 16 de mayo, en el tema del sector privado, se hablaba en términos de will explore, exploraríamos, tendríamos, es decir, ellos se mueven en una línea de que están reconociendo explícitamente de que eso no es posible si no se establecen los mecanismos adecuados.
In the announcement made on May 16 in the language, they do spoke about exploring the possibilities of the private sector, and they did acknowledge that they cannot help to the development of this sector without creating the conditions.
Pero ahí caemos en la otra contradicción, que sería cualquier diseño de estos mecanismos para que funcionen pasa necesariamente por entidades estatales cubanas.
But that then it leads us to the next contradiction. Any improvement in this mechanism goes precisely through the creation of mechanisms with the Cuban government.
Entonces, en ese sentido, están, en mi opinión, atrapados en esa gran contradicción.
So they are stuck in this big contradiction, in my opinion.
Y no es posible avanzar adecuadamente en áreas de interés común si se prevalece la visión de confrontación que está latente en este minuto.
And it is not possible to move forward in areas of common interest if they persist in this confrontation climate.
Entonces, para ir terminando, que me quedan solamente 3 minutos, entendemos que el camino hacia la recomposición partiría de 3 componentes fundamentales. Primero, los pilares, las prioridades y las acciones.
So we understand that the work towards the recomposition of relationship is based on 3 pillars. Foundations, pillars, priorities, and actions.
Sí, los pilares en los que se basa actualmente el enfoque y la visión de la política de Biden hacia Cuba no permite transitar hacia un camino de recomposición de las relaciones.
The pillars or foundations of the Biden administration vision towards Cuba policy does not allow to work towards the improvement of the bilateral relations between the 2 countries.
Se requeriría un replanteamiento de esos pilares, en primer lugar.
So they need to rethink these foundations.
Segundo lugar, se requeriría un replanteamiento de las prioridades.
Second, they will need to review the priorities,
Y se requeriría desplegar un grupo de acción.
and they will have to act accordingly to this review.
Sí, el pilar esencial en nuestra opinión y el punto de partida sería el diálogo entre ambos gobiernos basado en intereses nacionales.
The main foundation will be the dialogue between both governments based on national interests.
Sí, el factor, el driver, el motor impulsor de un proceso de recomposición partiría esencialmente de una condición necesaria que sería un diálogo constructivo sustantivo entre ambos gobiernos.
The driving force towards the recomposition of the bilateral relations would be a constructive dialogue between the 2 governments.
Intercambios en condiciones de igualdad, reciprocidad y respeto mutuo.
Also, this exchange should be done in conditions of equality, reciprocity, and mutual respect,
Sin condicionamiento ni condiciones.
without conditions or demands.
Y la confrontación y las diferencias pasarían a un segundo plano.
And confrontation and difference will take a back seat
Y
in the dialogue.
tendría que empezarse una voluntad y una determinación firme de avanzar en este proceso.
And they will have to express a willingness and determination to move forward in this process.
Entonces, como esto es un marco estratégico que se mueve sobre ciertos límites, no estamos hablando de, por supuesto, esto es en el marco y en el contexto de un conflicto histórico que tiene una esencia bien clara.
Of course, since all these will take place within the limits set by the framework of a relationship that is marked by a historical conflict.
Pero la etapa de Obama demostró que bajo estos límites se puede avanzar hacia un proceso de convivencia civilizada.
However, Obama's administration showed that it is possible to move forward a peaceful coexistence.
Entonces, en esa visión, aquí no hay que inventar nada nuevo, sino que hay un camino transitado, ¿verdad?
So with this vision, we already have a path we can walk on. We should not come up with new things.
Siempre me llama la atención en la directiva de Obama las prioridades.
And the priorities of the Obama directives has always called my attention.
Eso es texto de la directiva. Primero, interacción entre ambos gobiernos en temas de interés común.
This is what the Obama's directive said as priorities. First one, the interaction between both governments on topics of common interest.
Intercambio pueblo a pueblo.
People-to-people exchange.
Expansión del comercio.
Expansion of trade.
Diálogo sobre temas económicos y regulatorios.
Dialogue on economic and regulation topics.
Y el quinto nivel de prioridad, la derechos humanos.
And
Está presente, pero un quinto nivel de
The
prioridad.
fifth topic is human rights. It is included in the priorities, but it comes in the 5th place.
Entonces, para culminar ya muy rápido, se requieren acciones, empezando por el desmontaje de la política de máxima presión.
And to conclude, the actions that will require this will be the elimination of the maximum pressure policy
diálogos entre gobiernos
and the dialogue between the governments
y un grupo de medidas regulatorias que abarcarían 3 áreas: viajes, intercambio, transacciones bancarias financieras, comercio y negocio.
and regulatory measures that will comprise 3 categories: travel and exchanges, financial bank transfers, transactions, and business and trade.
Ya, termino con una cita del Papa Francisco. Esta cita yo la tomé vamos a decir, del libro del profesor Leogrande y Peter Cotton, lo más encubierta, pero viene muy a tono porque es una reflexión que hizo el Papa Francisco sobre el momento de restablecimiento de las relaciones. Que dice: Dios siempre quiere construir puentes, somos nosotros quienes construimos muros, y los muros se derrumban siempre.
I would like to finish my presentation with a quote from Francis Pope from the book Undercover Diplomacy, in which he said, God always builds bridges and humans build walls, but the walls always fall.
Muchas gracias, Rafael. Hay una cuestión aquí práctica que como se está haciendo una interpretación simultánea, el tiempo es el doble. En aras de lo justo, no es que yo le esté dando más tiempo a Rafael que a los demás, sino que en la práctica había que hacerlo de esta manera. Vamos entonces muy rápidamente para terminar de cierta manera un poco este enfoque bilateral. Yo le propongo escuchar a Julio Rensoli, que nos habla de un tema que tiene implicaciones bilaterales, y después entonces veríamos los últimos 2 presentaciones que tienen más que ver con el hemisferio occidental y la relación Cuba-Estados Unidos colocada en ese contexto del hemisferio occidental. Le damos la palabra entonces a Julio y le pedimos que haga las 2 cosas, que sea lo más breve que pueda, pero también que le dé el espacio es un esfuerzo, pero bueno.
Bueno, buenos días.
Good morning. Good morning.
Que a nadie le quepa dudas de que el tema del racismo es un tema de la agenda de la subvención de Estados Unidos contra Cuba.
Nobody should have a doubt that this issue of racism is an issue in the agenda of subversion in the United States.
Nosotros hemos identificado 5 líneas de esos objetivos.
We have identified 5 lines of those objectives.
Las voy a mencionar y después las voy a abrir.
I will mention them and then I will just explain
Primera,
them.
Estados Unidos trata de demostrar que en Cuba existe un racismo sistémico,
The United States
estructural e institucional.
tries to just provide the idea that in Cuba there is a systemic, structural, and racism.
Segundo,
Secondly,
un objetivo claro es fraccionar la sociedad cubana desde una mirada cromática.
is to divide the Cuban society from a chromatic point of view position.
Cromática que tratan de confundir con con un fraccionamiento étnico. Y vamos a explicar por qué no puede ser.
Chromatic meaning that trying to divide the society from an ethnic point of view.
Tercero, un objetivo claro es crear organizaciones que supuestamente luchen contra ese racismo que queda demostrado en la sociedad cubana, pero siempre bajo el liderazgo de los Estados Unidos.
Third, that there's always they try to just conform a type of racism that is still in. That is according to the United States, that is still based in the society, in the Cuban society, but from the perspective of the United States.
Una cuarta línea es fabricar líderes y lideresas.
And the third line is to fabricate leaders and women leaders.
De piel negra en todos los movimientos contrarrevolucionarios que se crean en el país.
Of black skin color in all of the decent movements that are created in the country.
Y la quinta línea es tratar de demostrar la incapacidad del gobierno cubano para resolver el problema del racismo.
And the fifth is to show the incapacity, the inability of the Cuban government to address the issue of racism.
Bueno, Está en la agenda esto desde inicios del siglo XXI, desde el año 2000.
It has been in that agenda since the early 2019th century, 2019th century,
Y hay que reconocer que
21st century.
the 21st century.
incluso hay que reconocer que lograron determinado éxito hasta 2019.
And it should be recognized that they had some successes until the 2019.
Nosotros vamos a hablar de esos éxitos.
We will speak about those successes.
Y que después del 2019, cuando el gobierno cubano aprueba un programa nacional contra el racismo, que es un punto de inflexión, tratan de recomponer la estrategia.
And after the 2019, when the Cuban government created the National Program Against Racism and Racial Discrimination, they tried to reconstruct that strategy.
Bueno, hay que decir que se han hecho en Harvard 2 congresos sobre estudios raciales en Cuba.
Two congresses have been held in Harvard on racial studies in Cuba,
2016-2018,
2016 and 2018.
Convocando a activistas e investigadores cubanos.
They summoned Cuban activists and researchers,
No reconociendo como auspiciadores a ninguna institución cubana. No somos parte de esa organización.
not recognizing as co-sponsors any Cuban entity.
En esa propia universidad
We are not part of that.
se había creado previamente el Instituto de Estudios Afrocubanos.
But previously, the Center for Afro-Cuban Studies was created before,
Bajo la dirección de un cubano emigrado, el doctor Alejandro Rafuente.
under the leadership of an emigrated Cuban doctor, Alejandro.
Además de esa
Fuentes.
universidad, nosotros conocemos de otras cuatro universidades que tienen programas de estudios sobre Cuba, específicamente en cuanto a temas raciales.
Apart from those from those universities, we know about 4 other universities that conduct studies on this on racism in Cuba.
Bueno, increíblemente el presidente Trump, que ha sido uno de los más grandes racistas de los presidentes de Estados Unidos,
Incredibly, President Trump, who has been one of the major racist presidents, racist presidents in the United States,
saludó, recibió, intercambió con supuestos dirigentes contra el racismo en Cuba.
greeted, spoke, and had exchanges with several Cubans who deal with these issues of racism.
O sea, reprimió muchos afroamericanos en los Estados Unidos, muchas manifestaciones, creó un muro contra México, pero en el caso de los cubanos,
He repressed many of the protests of the Afro-Americans in the United States. He rejected the Mexicans, but he welcomed some Cuban Afro-Americans.
ahora le acaban de entregar un premio a ese llamado Movimiento San Isidro.
Recently, they awarded a prize to those who wrongly called San Isidro movement.
Que bueno, no se acordaban del nombre y le pusieron San Isidoro.
They
Son
did not
santos distintos.
remember the name, and so they gave him the name of Isidoro.
Trataron de demostrar todo el tiempo que ese movimiento, que
They
ellos
tried
llaman un
to
movimiento
show,
era de lucha contra, o sea, a favor de los derechos humanos,
They
incluyendo
that this
Lo de los negros.
movement was always a movement advocating for the human rights of the black people.
desde inicio del año del siglo XXI,
Since early 21st century,
intentaron crear organizaciones con estos objetivos.
they have attempted to create organizations with these objectives.
Inicialmente, el Comité Ciudadano para la Integración Racial de
Initially-
Madrazo y compañía,
Initially, the movement for racial integration,
ajá. La Cofradía de la Negritud, que no surgió bajo el amparo de la bandera norteamericana, pero después fue a buscar abrigo allí también.
And also the Cofradia of Negritude, like the company of blackness, which was not initially created under the helm of the United States, but they later sought the support of the United States.
Y hay, porque en Cuba hay más de 50 grupos de activistas antirracistas.
And since there are over 50 anti-racism activists in Cuba,
No lo lograron comprar, pero todo el mundo fue a Harvard a los dos congresos. Fueron invitados y fueron.
they didn't manage to buy them all, but they all attended the 2 congresses in Harvard.
Por lo tanto, nosotros decimos que tuvieron convocatoria realmente.
So we say that they were really able to summon people.
Es muy difícil creer que la contrarrevolución cubana acepte líderes negros.
It is hard to believe that the Cuban counter-revolution will accept Black leaders.
O sea, todas aquellas organizaciones que vimos en los años 60, que todavía quedan, la Brigada 2506, imagínense, Alfa 66, toda esa gente fueron históricamente racistas.
All those counter-revolutionary organizations that were born in the 1960s, and some of them still exist today, such as Brigade 2506 and Alpha 66, they were openly racist,
Incluso la Fundación Cubano-Americana.
even the Cuban American Foundation.
Y de pronto aparecen en el escenario en Cuba muchos grupos contrarrevolucionarios con líderes y lideresas de color de piel negra.
And suddenly we have a lot of, there's just a lot of counter-revolutionary organizations led by Black men and women start to appear in Cuba.
Hay que recordar que de acuerdo a los datos censales, el 36% de la población cubana es negra o mulata.
We must remember that according to the population census, 36% of the Cuban population is Black.
Y aunque hay 3 provincias que tienen más de un 80% de población blanca, otras 13 que tienen, otras 10 que tienen más de un 70% de población blanca, hay 5 provincias muy decisorias donde la población negra y mulata tiene números importantes.
And although there are 3 provinces in Cuba where the population is mostly white, up to the 80%, and other 13 provinces where 70% of the population is mostly white, there are 5 determining provinces in the country in which the Black population is the highest rate.
En las 3 del sur oriental, Granma, Santiago de Cuba y Guantánamo son mayoría.
In the 3 eastern provinces of Granma, Santiago de Cuba, and Guantánamo, the population is mostly Black.
Y en La Habana y la Isla de la Juventud casi somos 50-50.
And in Havana and the special municipality of Isla de la Juventud, we are half and half.
Entonces en La Habana se puede decidir este problema.
So Havana has the power to determine over this problem.
Captar a esa población que es el 42% en La Habana es algo que constituye un objetivo.
So recruiting this population, which constitute 42% of the population in Havana, is one of the goals of the counter-revolution.
Y han logrado que se digan mentiras que han sido reconocidas.
And they have succeeded in making them to say lies that have been recognized.
Hubo un promotor cultural cubano que dijo al Washington Post que la revolución no había llegado a los negros en Cuba.
There was a Black cultural promoter who told the Washington Post that the revolution has not reached the Black Cubans.
Y el presidente Obama en el Gran Teatro de La Habana dijo una mentira que la gente aplaudió porque no la analizó.
And President Obama, in his speech in the Great Theater of Havana, said a lie that was largely applauded by those present.
Dijo, ustedes y nosotros tenemos una historia común de esclavistas y esclavos.
He said, we share a story of slaves and slave owners.
Y dijo que la historia era igual.
And he said that we share the same history.
Y después nos combinó a olvidar la historia.
And then he told us to forget about this history.
Bueno, primero teníamos la historia igual, después olvidémonos de la historia. No es igual la historia de formación de la nación estadounidense y la historia de formación de las naciones latinoamericanas, pero la peculiaridad de la cubana es muy distinta.
He told us first that we share a story, then he told us to forget about this story. And I would like to say that the history of formation of the United States and the Latin American nations are not the same. And in the case of Cuba, there are some particular features.
Pero decir eso parece algo inocente.
Saying something like this may seem naive.
Y no es nada inocente.
But it's not naive at all.
En Cuba no existe sociológicamente una mayoría étnica con minorías étnicas o nacionales.
Sociologically speaking, Cuba does not have an ethnical majority and ethnical minorities.
Tenemos una composición cromática muy diversa.
We have a very diverse chromatic composition.
De hecho, hay 105 tonos de piel de 110 que tiene el ser humano.
In fact, there are of the 110 skin tones that exist, Cuba has 105.
En Cuba tú puedes dar una clase de policromía dermatológica.
In Cuba, you can easily teach a class of skin polychromat.
Pero sin embargo, etnológicamente somos un solo pueblo.
But ethnologically speaking, Cuba is only one people.
Antropológicamente somos un etnos nación.
Anthropologically, we are a nation ethnos.
Y por lo tanto, no existe en Cuba una composición étnica que nos haga que los cubanos y cubanas tengamos culturas distintas entre nosotros.
Therefore, there is not a composition in the Cuban population that makes each group have a culture that is their own.
Tenemos hábitos, costumbres y tradiciones iguales,
We share the same traditions, customs, and habits,
matizadas por peculiaridades regionales y locales, pero todas atravesadas por la cubanía y la cubanidad.
influenced by local and regional characteristics, but they are all part of the Cuban identity.
Y por lo tanto, no es igual a la sociedad estadounidense.
And therefore, this is a factor that makes us different from the US society,
Es multiétnica, multinacional y multicultural.
which is multi-ethnic, multinational, and multi-ethnic, multinational, and multicultural.
Desde otro punto de vista, no puede haber racismo sistémico en Cuba porque para que haya racismo sistémico y estructural, el modo de producción lo tiene que producir y reproducir.
And also, we cannot speak about structural racism on systemic racism in Cuba, because in order for that to exist, the production methods have to produce it and reproduce it.
Lo que pasa es que estudiamos filosofía en primer año y después se nos olvida, pero es así.
The problem is that we only study philosophy in the freshman year and then we forget about it, but it is that way.
El socialismo no produce ni reproduce ninguna de las discriminaciones sociales.
Socialism does not produce, nor reproduces any of the ways of the form of social discrimination.
Existen e incluso pueden reproducirse condiciones objetivas por la historia que arrastra.
It can exist and reproduced in socialism because of the historic conditions of that discrimination.
Y por las condiciones en que se desarrolla,
For the conditions it developed.
que en el caso cubano es la de un bloqueo terrible de más de 60 años.
And in the case of Cuba, these conditions happen under a blockade that has been in place for over 60 years.
Y una historia de 500 años no se borra en 60.
And a history of 500 years cannot be erased in 60.
Y por eso hay barrios en La Habana de los llamados desfavorecidos sociales y en otras ciudades
So that's why there are some neighborhoods in Cuba that are known as marginalized and low-income neighborhoods,
donde predominan la población de un color de piel determinado, distinta a otros barrios privilegiados.
where the predominant population has a particular skin color as compared to other neighborhoods with better economic advantages.
Pero estamos hablando de un país mestizo y socialista.
But we are talking about a country that is mixed and that is socialist.
No vamos a explicar la complejidad del problema, pero no es igual que Estados Unidos.
We're not going to enter into the details of the complexity of the problem, but it is not the same as in the United States.
Ahora, ¿qué impacto ha tenido esto con la intelectualidad norteamericana y su relación con la cubana?
So what has been the impact of this issue with the American intellectual and their relation with the Cuban intellectuals?
Hablábamos de un éxito aparente en un tiempo porque llegaron a preocuparse.
We spoke about an apparent success because they were really concerned about it.
En la UNIAC recibimos una carta de intelectuales afroamericanos preocupados por el racismo en Cuba.
We received a letter from American intellectuals who were concerned about racism in Cuba.
Era lógico que así se entendiera.
It was logical they saw it that way.
Recordemos que ese movimiento de los derechos civiles estuvo presente en el Hotel Teresa en el 60, sus principales líderes con Fidel allí.
Let's remember that some of the leaders of the civil rights movement were in the Teresa Hotel with Fidel Castro in the 1960s.
Que recordaban la campaña por la libertad de Angela Davis.
And who remembered when Fidel was campaigning for the freedom of Angela Davis.
Y nuestra presencia en los movimientos de liberación en el África.
And also our Cuba's presence in the liberation movements in Africa.
Nuestra solidaridad sobre más de 100 países de todos los continentes.
Our solidarity with liberation movements in countries in all continents.
Y de pronto reciben una información que el 11 de julio hubo una represión racial en Cuba.
And suddenly they received the information that on July 11 there was a racial repression in Cuba.
Entonces hemos tenido que explicar las razones por las cuales negamos eso y tenemos que explicar nuestra realidad.
And we have to explain the reasons why this was not truth and to explain the reality of Cuba.
Ahora, la Comisión Aponte de la UNIAC, que propició que el Estado cubano se pronunciara con un programa nacional contra el racismo y la discriminación racial, ha logrado revertir la situación.
Now, the Aponte Commission, which influence of the Cuban government to approve the national program against racism, has managed to somehow reverse this situation.
Y ahora son ellos los que tienen que tratar de hacer otro cuento, porque lo tienen en la agenda, quieren seguir persistiendo sobre el tema, pero ya la situación no se ve igual.
And now it is the term of those Black leaders of the counter-revolution to change the narrative, because even though it is still included in the agenda, that people, they are telling this story know better now.
Yo termino con lo que voy a decir. Lo más difícil es que desde territorio cubano, personas, inclusive que ocupan determinada responsabilidad en el mundo intelectual y académico, bebiendo de la fuente de fuentes foráneas, utilizan términos que nada tienen que ver con nuestra realidad y se hacen cómplices de temas como un racismo estructural en Cuba, de la existencia de una comunidad afrocubana inexistente, y eso es lo que ha posibilitado determinado éxito por parte de los mecanismos de la subversión.
And and now people from Cuba are using terms that are used in foreign sources, and these terms have managed to get them some success in this agenda.
Bueno, nosotros ahora estamos en la ofensiva. Muchas gracias.
But now we are in the offensive. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias. Vamos ahora a mover un poco el foco de lo más estrictamente bilateral a algo más a lo multilateral en cuestiones del hemisferio occidental y el impacto hacia Cuba. Vamos a tener las últimas dos presentaciones, una del profesor Phil Brenner, que la ha titulado Cuba and the United States in a Changed Western Hemisphere. Y después vamos a tener finalmente la presentación de Leandro Morgenfeld, a quien le agradecemos su paciencia, sobre la política de Biden hacia América Latina y su impacto en Cuba.
Gracias, Raúl. I want to echo my colleagues' appreciation to Ambassador Jose Cabañas and the organizing committee for this event, and to Vice Minister Cosio for his continuing support that we have this annual event, which is a great opportunity to meet and exchange ideas. I'll try to be briefer than the time I was allotted because I want to give you a chance to have some questions. I have a very simple question to ask, and that is, what will be the possibility of influence from the Western Hemisphere on the relationship between Cuba and the United States? This question arises because of the pressure that was perceived in Washington from Latin America, as Professor Leogrande pointed out, in 2012, that led to the successful negotiations between Cuba and the United States between 2013 and 2017. So the first thing I want to highlight is that the circumstances then are different than they are now. Three important changes that I think even despite, aside from President Trump taking office, might have had an effect on the ability of the Western Hemisphere to have an impact on Cuban-US relations. The first is the decline of ALBA. ALBA was very important because of the ability to provide oil and funding for countries in the region. But by 2017, the economy in Venezuela prevented that from taking place. Cuba and Venezuela gained great influence, partly because of ALBA's success. The second factor was the changes in governments in Latin America, the move to the right, which would have happened regardless of whether Trump had taken office. And the third factor was there was a declining interest in the United States in Latin America itself. And so there was no perception that whatever Latin America said mattered. Some of these factors continue now, but let's take a look at what's happening in 2022. Of course, the first thing is that there were elections, and you have someone like President López Obrador making extraordinary statements in support of Cuba. You have the Prime Minister from Barbados, Mia Amor-Motley, saying directly to Vice President Kamala Harris that Cuba's opening of its tertiary education facilities to Caribbean youths and its highly recognized eye care program have been immense values for decades. And she added, its outreach to Barbados and so many other CARICOM countries with nurses and doctors to join the battle against COVID trumps all others. Now, if you were in Washington, you'd have to recognize these strong statements from important allies. Another administration might have perceived this as pressure from the Western Hemisphere, but the Biden administration was steadfast until recently in maintaining the Trump administration's policy. So I want to introduce the idea and to change the narrative that both Professor Leogrande and Professor Armstrong said of the word pressure. And I want to introduce the idea of space. So that's what I want to talk a little bit about. One indication of the Biden administration's willingness to ignore so-called pressure from Latin America and the Caribbean was its lack of attention to the Summit of the Americas. It was terribly prepared. For example, they waited until August of 2021 to even issue a request from cities in the United States as to who would host this event that was going to take place 10 months later. The summit produced almost nothing meaningful. Meanwhile, Mexico refused to send the president, only the foreign minister attended. Caribbean countries threatened not to attend, and they were very strong in the denunciations of US policy towards Cuba. Such an embarrassment, if the president cared about the region, would have led Biden to fire Juan Gonzalez, the National Security Advisor for Latin America, as President Obama did in firing Dan Restrepo, the National Security Advisor for Latin America, after the 2012 summit. But Juan Gonzalez remains in his place, still making policy. And it's not simply that he doesn't care about US policy towards Cuba. He is active opponent. He was an active opponent of the policy of the Obama administration. So that would suggest that there were really no possibility for pressure from the Western Hemisphere. But since July, circumstances have changed. And these circumstances, I love the metaphor that Fulton Amstrong used of sanity. These circumstances enabled sanity to prevail. And that's to say, it allows the creation of a space that is not so much pressure, but it's a space where sanity takes the place of ideology. Sanity takes the place of craziness. The classic definition of insanity is trying to do something again and again, failing and thinking once you do it again, it'll be successful. That's insanity. And what sanity requires is the effort to see the reality around you. So there are 5 changes that have occurred just since the summer that I think are important in creating space. The first is that the problem of migration that President Biden identified as the problem of the Northern Triangle is no longer a problem of the Northern Triangle, but is a problem of migration from Cuba and Venezuela. Cubans and Venezuelans make up the largest percentage of migrants coming to the U.S. southern border. So that this places renewed attention now on Cuba and Venezuela as a real issue, the same way that previously El Salvador and Honduras and Guatemala, the Northern Triangle countries, were identified as a source of the problem. As a result, the United States has resumed migration talks with Cuba. Vice Minister Cosio mentioned this morning, and the United States encouraged the Venezuelan opposition to return to negotiations in Mexico. These are changes in U.S. policy that have an element of sanity, recognizing a changed circumstance. The second factor, of course, was the elections in Latin America, with particularly Gustavo Petro coming to power in Colombia and the election of Lula in Brazil. This becomes important for the third factor, and that is that the importance of Cuba for the national interests of both Colombia and Brazil, the importance of Cuba for their national interests makes their trying to resolve the problems of Cuba and the United States important for them. In the case of Colombia, the peace process is very important. It was not important for Ivan Duque. In fact, he opposed the peace process, but it is very important for President Petro. And Cuba's absolutely significant involvement as an interlocutor between the ELN and the Colombian government makes the importance of Cuba for Colombia more important than any other factor. There will be Cuban doctors in Colombia, there will be Cuban technical support, but Cuba's ability to help bring about peace in Colombia is quite significant in the Colombian national interest. In case of Brazil, President Lula has, this is actually quite complex. President Lula would like to reestablish Brazil as a leader of Latin America. The vision he has is to reinvigorate the institutions of hemispheric integration, such as CELAC, which Brazil was very important in, but Cuba is important in as well. And given that U.S.-Cuban hostility, or U.S. hostility towards Cuba, stands in the way of an important member country, Cuba, in the leadership of Brazil for the hemisphere, that makes better relations between Cuba and the United United States higher in Brazilian national interest. This is not just an ideological affinity on Lula's part. I think there was between President Lula and Fidel Castro an important personal affinity. But this now becomes in the national interest of Brazil. Of course, it's complicated by the fact that Lula is the leader of a coalition government. He's not the leader of just the PT. And that means that he has to satisfy more conservative elements, which means, for example, that while there may be some Cuban doctors that come back to Brazil, there won't be as many as there were when Dilma Rousseff was the president. So there will be some return and not as much. It's not the doctors that will be the interest. It'll be establishing a better relationship between Cuba and the United States so that doesn't interfere with Brazil's own interests in the region. Fourth factor, and I'm repeating some of what's been said, but these are issues, these are points that I think bear repetition. The appointment of former Senator Chris Dodd. It's possible that his appointment was the result of some of these other changes, but in any case, the importance of Dodd is that he's listening to Latin Americans, and what Latin Americans are telling him is that the problems that lead to things like migration from Cuba and Venezuela are caused in large part by the United States. That would bring, understanding that fact would mean the recognition, would be sanity. To the extent that he is hearing that, and he has the president's ear, makes that a very important message. The message from the 18 former heads of state and foreign ministers from Latin America and the Caribbean last month, which explicitly said that, calling for an end to the US hostility, to allowing remittances and more trade. But this was a very important statement that I think the president would not have paid attention to if Senator Dodd hadn't brought it to him. And finally, China. In this respect, I want to focus on China slightly differently than Professor Leogrande did, which of course, China is important, but the importance of China, I think in this respect, is that China is perceived as a threat in Washington. I don't think it is a threat to the United States, but it is perceived as a threat for the reasons that Professor Leogrande pointed to. And because it is a threat to the region, it means that the president will listen to the region more than he might have otherwise. The so-called Chinese threat actually works into the advantage of the president hearing the voices of Latin America for the first time and replacing the ideology, the domestic politics as factors and introducing sanity. That's what I mean about space. So to think about space is not to think about pressure from Latin America, but the way in which the interests of Latin Americans create an environment in which sanity can thrive. That makes it possible for improved relations between the United States as a result of the interests of Latin Americans. Thank you.
Bueno, vamos ahora a darle la palabra al profesor Leandro Morgenfeld, que también nos va a acercar a este tema desde la visión del sur. Bienvenido, Leandro, gracias por la paciencia y por favor, adelante.
Bueno, buenos días para todos y todos. Un saludo para Raúl, que es un querido colega de Cuba con el que trabajamos hace años. ¿Hay traducción simultánea o sigo nomás?
Sí. No.
Bien.
Sigue,
perfecto. Bueno, quería en primer lugar agradecer también especialmente al doctor José Ramón Cabañas Rodríguez, y en nombre de él, a todos los integrantes del CIP y del ISRI. Me hubiera gustado estar en forma presencial allá, como tuve la oportunidad en el 2017, en ese querido lugar, pero estoy muy feliz de estar acá en forma virtual y es un honor compartir este panel con 2 colegas de Cuba y 3 colegas muy prestigiosos de American University, así que los saludo. Y les quiero decir, esto no es una formalidad, que aprendí mucho y me surgieron muchas preguntas de las 5 exposiciones. Quiero decirles también, aunque no tenga nada que ver, que acá en Argentina estamos en un estado de conmoción y emoción después del triunfo por la Copa del Mundo, así que dormimos pocas horas. Sé que ustedes quieren mucho a Maradona, como Maradona los quería a ustedes. Nos dejó hace 2 años, el 25 de noviembre, en la misma fecha que nos dejó Fidel un poco antes. Así que estamos todos en Argentina en un estado de emoción y conmoción y esperamos poder representar a América Latina futbolísticamente. Bueno, yendo al tema, quiero decirles que soy uno de los co-coordinadores del grupo de trabajo de estudios sobre Estados Unidos de CEHSEU. Es un grupo de trabajo que desde el año 2004 intenta pensar a Estados Unidos y fundamentalmente el vínculo entre Estados Unidos y América Latina desde América Latina. Si estamos acostumbrados a que nos piensen América Latina desde Estados Unidos, hacemos el esfuerzo nosotros también a pensar a Estados Unidos hacia adentro y pensar las relaciones entre Estados Unidos y nuestra América, también desde América Latina. Hay varios colegas que están ahí presentes, que integran el grupo de trabajo de estudios sobre Estados Unidos, así que los saludo. Y como esta presentación es acotada por el tema del tiempo, los voy a invitar a leer nuestro último libro del grupo, que se llama justamente El legado de Trump en un mundo en crisis, que es una coedición de siglo XXI y CEHSEU, donde escribe Raúl y varios colegas del GT, que es un libro que está impreso, pero es un libro de libre acceso, igual que los 5 libros anteriores, así que lo pueden leer completo en la web de CEHSEU. Y también produjo el grupo 8 boletines, 8 números de nuestro boletín Estados Unidos, miradas críticas de nuestra América, y el boletín 5 y el boletín 7 abordan específicamente mi tema de exposición de hoy, que son las relaciones entre el gobierno de Biden y América Latina. Así que voy a plantear algunas ideas, varias cosas ya expusieron mis colegas anteriormente, algunas ideas que ustedes pueden desarrollar más con las lecturas de los boletines y de nuestro último libro. Primero, ¿no? Ustedes ya tuvieron 5 exposiciones extraordinarias, pero creo que es fundamental, como ya se dijo acá, para entender la política de Estados Unidos hacia América Latina, hacer un buen diagnóstico del actual complejo escenario internacional. Podríamos hablar mucho sobre esto, pero solamente decir que, como venimos planteando en el grupo de CEHSEU, en nuestro GT de CEHSEU, Estudios sobre Estados Unidos, asistimos, sobre todo en el 2008, a un declive de Estados Unidos, a un ascenso de China, y si queremos, en los últimos 4 años se han acelerado las tensiones y las confrontaciones entre Estados Unidos y China, como recién el profesor Brenner hacía alusión. En este sentido, hay un debate sobre 3 posibles escenarios a nivel global. Estamos asistiendo hacia un proceso clásico, si se quiere, de transición hegemónica, es decir, de fin de la hegemonía norteamericana de las últimas décadas y reemplazo hegemónico por parte de China. En el caso de este primer escenario, esa transición hegemónica será como las que ocurrieron en otros tiempos históricos, con un conflicto militar a gran escala, o será en forma pacífica. Son 2 escenarios distintos, y si es a través de una guerra, será como las guerras mundiales o como las guerras que marcaron otros procesos de transición histórica, o será, como plantean otros autores, con una guerra híbrida y fragmentada, como de hecho plantean algunos, se está dando ahora y se aceleró con el conflicto entre Rusia, Ucrania y la OTAN. Primer escenario, entonces, un reemplazo hegemónico. Segundo escenario posible, nos estamos moviendo hacia un mundo bipolar, es decir, durante varias décadas vamos a tener un mundo con 2 grandes polos, Estados Unidos y sus aliados en Occidente, y China y sus aliados en Asia-Pacífico, y durante varias décadas vamos a tener un escenario de bipolaridad. Y ahí hay que plantearse si estamos en un periodo histórico que puede ser comparable con la Guerra Fría, como muchas veces leemos por parte de distintos analistas y en la prensa, o no. Yo creo que no, pero segundo escenario, un mundo durante un tiempo de bipolaridad. Tercer escenario, estamos en una transición hacia un mundo inéditamente multipolar, que ni siquiera va a ser con dos grandes polos, sino que va a ser con otros polos, y algunos dicen que es el escenario al que estamos moviéndonos. En cualquier caso, esos tres escenarios, y es muy importante, es difícil hacer un pronóstico de un proceso que no está definido, en cualquiera de esos tres escenarios hay que entenderlos y situarlos para pensar el vínculo entre Estados Unidos y América Latina. Lo que sí es claro y cierto para mí es que estamos frente a un periodo que se va a extender, por lo menos por algunos años, de enorme desorden mundial. Estados Unidos tiene una profunda crisis en su hegemonía global, es decir, lo que nosotros venimos planteando desde hace por lo menos 15 años en el grupo de trabajo de estudios sobre Estados Unidos, que muchos lo discutían, hoy creo que es un consenso bastante importante, que a Estados Unidos está costando sostener esa hegemonía global, pero además Estados Unidos, como bien se dijo en este panel, atraviesa múltiples crisis y fracturas internas. De orden económico, está en un proceso de estanflación, con la mayor inflación en 40 años en este momento. De orden político, que ya se dijo acá y se vio, entre otras cosas, reflejado en las últimas elecciones en Estados Unidos. De orden social, con una creciente polarización, pero también de orden migratorio y medioambiental. De hecho, en las disputas entre Trump y Biden expresan las disputas entre dos grandes fracciones de la clase dominante norteamericana, es decir, la fracción americanista y la fracción globalista, con todos los matices del caso. Yendo al tema que nos convoca, por lo menos para plantear en el tiempo que tenemos algunas ideas, ¿cómo pensar el vínculo entre Estados Unidos y América Latina? Nos gusta en el grupo de Claxo pensarlo en términos de rupturas y continuidades. En general, la prensa globalista, liberal y muchos analistas de esta corriente exageran las rupturas entre demócratas y republicanos, entre Trump y Biden, y nosotros sostenemos en el grupo que es muy importante, en primer lugar, plantear las continuidades. Lo que nosotros llamamos el gobierno permanente de Estados Unidos mantiene los objetivos. Por lo menos podríamos decir hace 200 años. En diciembre del año que viene se van a cumplir 200 años de la doctrina Monroe. De hecho, estoy preparando un trabajo, un ensayo sobre el tema, un próximo libro que va a salir editado el año que viene. Esperemos poder estar presentándolo ahí en el evento que está organizando el CEHSEU para mayo del año que viene. La doctrina Monroe, para sintetizarlo, planteaba, ¿sí?, fuera las potencias extrahemisféricas de lo que Estados Unidos considera su patio trasero, el hemisferio occidental. Primero fue Gran Bretaña y Europa, después fue la Unión Soviética, hoy es China. Segundo, garantizar el dominio de Estados Unidos sobre lo que consideran, digamos, su área de influencia exclusiva, su patio trasero. Y tercero, y fundamental para lo que voy a decir después, alentar un proceso de balcanización regional, es decir, divide y reinarás. Tratar de evitar que el viejo sueño de Bolívar y después de Martí se concrete, es decir, que avancen los procesos de coordinación, cooperación política e integración regional. Dicho esto, que hay que ponerlo en primer lugar, y que creo que ya se planteó, el viceministro de Relaciones Exteriores lo decía, el bloqueo no solo se mantiene con la administración Biden, sino que está más duro que nunca, es decir, ni siquiera se volvió a lo que se había logrado durante la distensión del segundo mandato de Obama. Dicho esto y planteado esto, hay que ver también las rupturas y las diferencias, es decir, más allá de que las continuidades profundas, los objetivos estratégicos de Estados Unidos, de dividir a la región, de derrotar a la revolución cubana, se mantienen, hay diferencias. Y en este sentido, Trump no es lo mismo que Biden. Trump apostaba por el unilateralismo unipolar, mientras que Biden tiene una política exterior más multilateral, aunque para defender el mismo unipolarismo. Si Trump apelaba al hard power, Biden, como Obama en algún sentido, plantea una política exterior que apela al smart power. Si Trump tenía como principal interlocutor en la región a Bolsonaro, claramente Biden prefiere como interlocutores a Boric, a Alberto Fernández o a Lula, como ya se dijo acá. Si Trump tenía una retórica muy dura contra los gobiernos no alineados, recordemos Bolton y la Troika del Mar, Cuba, Venezuela y Nicaragua, durante las administraciones demócratas en muchos casos se logró al menos una relativa distensión. El ejemplo de Obama, que ya se dijo acá, durante el segundo mandato. Si Trump decía solo voy a defender los intereses económicos de mi país y propiciaba relaciones bilaterales, como ya se dijo acá también, Biden supuestamente promueve la democracia, los derechos humanos y el cuidado del medio ambiente, sabiendo lo que eso significa, ¿no? Pero son discursos y en parte políticas que habilitan respuestas distintas desde nuestra América. Para sintetizar, creo que la reciente cumbre de las Américas, ¿sí?, como las cumbres anteriores, la que se hizo en Los Ángeles, es un buen termómetro para hacer una suerte de balance del primer año y medio, si queremos, de Biden en la Casa Blanca. Y como ya se dijo también acá, con Biden no se pudo volver, o por lo menos por ahora, a la política hacia América Latina que se había desplegado en el segundo gobierno de Obama. Es decir, se rindió ante los Bob Menéndez, ante los Marco Rubios, y decidió, poco antes del inicio de la cumbre, excluir a los gobiernos de Cuba, Venezuela y Nicaragua. Sin embargo, como decimos coloquialmente aquí, le salió el tiro por la culata, porque eso provocó una reacción soberana muy importante de Andrés Manuel López Obrador, que fue secundada por el presidente de Bolivia, por la presidenta, ¿sí?, por la presidenta de Honduras, Xiomara Castro, por los países del ALBA y por otros gobiernos. Y el día que terminaba una cumbre muy deslucida, donde hubo récord de ausencia de mandatarios de América Latina y del Caribe, el mismo día terminaba una enorme conferencia latinoamericana que organizó Claxo, que se hizo en la Ciudad de México, con un recital de más de 200.000 personas en el Zócalo, escuchando a Silvio Rodríguez. Creo que son dos imágenes simbólicas de ese fracaso de Biden en la última cumbre de las Américas. Ahora bien, ¿qué oportunidades se abren, ¿sí?, para la región frente a este desorden global que simplemente mencioné al principio, frente a las dificultades internas y externas que atraviesa Estados Unidos para sostener su hegemonía a nivel global y su dominio sobre América Latina y el Caribe, y frente a la coyuntura política y social cambiante en América Latina? Porque recordemos que de las protestas en 2018 y 2019, previas a la pandemia, asistimos a un cambio de signo político de la mayor parte de los gobiernos de la región, y aquellas teorías o aquellos diagnósticos que planteaban una inevitable restauración conservadora desde el 2015, es decir, hubo un avance de los gobiernos de derecha y de ultraderecha. Sin embargo, del 2018 para adelante, cambiaron de signo los gobiernos de México, de la Argentina, de Bolivia, de Perú, de Colombia, de Chile, de Honduras y de Brasil, entre muchos otros. Esto ofrece una enorme oportunidad para la región. Creo que la próxima cumbre de la CELAC, que se va a realizar en Argentina, puede ser una oportunidad para desplegar una activa política exterior en función de aumentar la autonomía regional, de priorizar políticas favorables a los pueblos y no a las corporaciones y a los organismos internacionales de crédito. También creo que es una oportunidad para nuestra región para alzar la voz y contribuir a disminuir las tensiones bélicas que hoy estremecen al mundo y tornan cada vez más peligrosa la amenaza de un desastre nuclear. O sea, de los primeros escenarios que planteé, hay que decirlo, hace 2 o 3 años, pocos veían probable un enfrentamiento o una deriva militar en el marco de las tensiones geopolíticas entre Estados Unidos, China y Rusia. Bueno, hoy ese escenario no es tan improbable, producto, entre otras cosas, del endurecimiento de la administración Biden, no solo con Rusia, sino también con China por el tema Taiwán. Nuestra América, en esta inestable y dramática coyuntura de desorden global, de conflictos bélicos, de recesiones económicas, de amenazas de hambruna, de crisis migratorias y recrudecimiento del deterioro medioambiental, está llamada a jugar un rol relevante. Es muy importante, desde mi punto de vista, discutir la idea de los centros del imperio y de las élites locales, de que América Latina es irrelevante, es decir, un proceso de autodenigración nacional, ¿sí?, que las élites de cada uno de nuestros países, por lo menos en Argentina es muy evidente, tratan de generar impotencia en nuestros propios pueblos para cambiar el estado de cosas. En primer lugar, creo que es fundamental que retomemos las instancias de cooperación y coordinación políticas e integración regional para afrontar estos desafíos. Recuperar el Mercosur, es decir, levantando la suspensión de Venezuela y terminando el proceso de incorporación a Bolivia que frenaron los gobiernos de la derecha. Tenemos una oportunidad ahora con el ascenso de Lula al gobierno de Brasil. Recuperar o revitalizar la CELAC, y por eso es fundamental, y creo que va a ser fundamental la próxima cumbre, ¿sí? Y recuperar la UNASUR. Es decir, hace pocos días, expresidentes de toda la región dijeron es fundamental que relancemos la UNASUR. Si la UNASUR no hubiera sido prácticamente destruida por los gobiernos de derecha, hoy la crisis que vive el gobierno de Perú podía haber sido tramitada de otra manera. En segundo lugar, promoviendo en los foros multilaterales un orden multipolar que cuestione las jerarquías establecidas por las potencias del llamado norte global. Eso requiere un esfuerzo enorme. Logramos hace pocas semanas voltear a Mauricio Claver Carone de la conducción del BID, y sin embargo no pudimos tener una estrategia conjunta entre México, Argentina, Brasil y otros actores para llevar un candidato propio, división que permitió que asuma el candidato que va a asumir, o asumió el candidato propuesto por el gobierno de Bolsonaro, apoyado por Estados Unidos y por el propio gobierno argentino. En tercer lugar, impulsando iniciativas que permitan proteger y poner en valor los abundantes y codiciados bienes comunes de la tierra que abundan en América Latina, para desarrollarlos en función de las necesidades de sus pueblos y no de las corporaciones capitalistas globales. Por último, como zona de paz, debemos plantear un alto al fuego en Ucrania y exigiendo una desmilitarización y desarme a nivel global y en la región, empezando por el retiro de las bases militares de la OTAN, diseminadas desde Centroamérica hasta nuestras Islas Malvinas, y rearmando el Consejo Suramericano de Defensa para defender la soberanía. Y sumo un punto más. Nuestra América, y esto puede plantearse en la próxima cumbre de la CELAC, debe exigir a Estados Unidos terminar y eliminar el criminal bloqueo contra Cuba y las sanciones contra Venezuela como condición necesaria para restablecer o para potenciar un vínculo entre Estados Unidos y el resto de la región. Cierro con esto. Ya con Lula en el gobierno a partir del próximo 1 de enero, en el año 2023, hay una oportunidad histórica y quizás efímera para avanzar en la concreción de algunas iniciativas que se esbozaron en los últimos tiempos. Ejemplo, discutir conjuntamente las condiciones para la explotación de los recursos estratégicos naturales que tiene América Latina. Por ejemplo, plantear una OPEP del litio junto a una empresa estatal latinoamericana para explotarlo, algo de lo que hablaron Evo Morales o el actual presidente mexicano. Segundo, avanzar hacia una mayor autonomía financiera y monetaria que disminuya la dependencia del dólar, ya sea con una moneda común, como propuso recientemente Lula, o bien ampliando el intercambio en monedas propias, como en algún sentido avanzaron países del ALBA en los últimos años. Tercero, plantear una investigación y una moratoria conjunta de la deuda externa, es decir, la rendición individual que muchos de nuestros países plantean ante el Fondo Monetario Internacional y otros organismos. Cuarto, avanzar hacia una política sanitaria soberana, que podría plantear, por ejemplo, la producción conjunta de vacunas propias desarrolladas, como las que pudo hacer Cuba durante la pandemia del COVID. Y último y más importante, empezar a negociar articuladamente en el marco de la CELAC con actores como Estados Unidos, la Unión Europea y China. Y cierro con esto. Si nuestra América no recupera rápidamente el camino de la integración, se seguirán profundizando las asimetrías internas y externas. No hay que olvidar que sigue siendo la región más desigual del mundo. Como ya estamos viendo en procesos locales, los cambios cosméticos no alcanzan. El proyecto emancipador no puede tener una escala meramente nacional. Hay que avanzar en la construcción de la patria grande. Sí, y lo último quiero cerrar. Si hoy estamos acá en eventos como estos, es gracias a que pese a la ofensiva imperial en el año 2018 y 2019, ni Cuba ni Venezuela cayeron como muchos predijeron tantas veces, y si hoy América Latina está teñida de otro color político, también tiene que ver con la esperanza que genera que David pueda seguir enfrentando a Goliat a pesar de las enormes asimetrías y a pesar de las enormes dificultades que hoy atraviesa nuestra América. Bueno, muchísimas gracias.
Bueno, me han puesto en la impopular tarea de decir que hemos terminado y que desafortunadamente por cuestiones de tiempo no hay tiempo para preguntas porque hay que terminar y después comenzar el segundo panel. Hemos tenido esta dificultad de, aunque los compañeros que han hecho la interpretación han hecho un esfuerzo enorme que debemos reconocer, el hecho de que la traducción sea simultánea duplica el tiempo y eso es algo inevitable. Esperemos que no. No, hoy es consecutiva. O sea, ya mañana va a haber traducción simultánea. Con traducción consecutiva se duplica el tiempo y eso es lo que ha conspirado contra la opción de poder tener nuestras disculpas y a las